primarily it's about focusing the minds of government. So it's about every government department making decisions not on the basis of all the other issues and sort of leaving climate out, but climate change being at the core of every decision. I'll give you an example. Decision on Heathrow expansion. We decided to have another runway at Heathrow. Have we really taken account of the need to get to zero carbon emissions by a certain date in the future? I think probably not as much as we should have done. So I think it's about every decision of government being kind of dedicated, if you like, to saying, well, does this help us with that journey? The other thing it does is it's about saying we need greater urgency. We need to move faster. I'll give you an example. Buildings, homes, private buildings, businesses. We need to both insulate them, change the way they're heated, and we're not going nearly fast enough.
But on the example of Heathrow, Labour MPs supported the expansion.
Some Labour
there was a free vote on that. Jeremy Corbyn didn't,
sure.
but people, when given that free vote, voted in that way.
Here is the thing I'll say, which is that all of politics, me included, haven't taken this seriously enough as an issue. I think in a way, I was climate change secretary a decade ago, but I think all of us have been jolted both by the science, in particular the report that came out last year saying we've got 10 years to turn this round, and also the protests. I mean, I think the protests have actually, but because I think whatever people think about the tactics, about Extinction Rebellion and so on, I think people have thought, well, the tactics we can agree with or disagree with, but in our hearts we know they're kind of right. We're not doing enough.
Do you agree with the tactics though, stopping people from going to work?
I'm not about to glue myself to the desk. I mean, it's not what I would do.
It'd be a rather long show then.
It would make news, but it's not what I would be doing. But I'm a politician. In a way, my job is to respond now that they've focused our minds. Now it's our job to show we can step up, if you like.
I'm not going to pause on this for too long because I want to go back to what you're saying, but just in the sense that there was a concern that some of the tactics with all the arrests, the waste of police time, could alienate some people from the cause. That was all.
I think, on balance, it's helped focus minds, if I'm honest. Okay. I think it's sort of... And I actually think there was something about the protest that was slightly different. I mean, this is a protest where they cheered the police and, they tried to clean up after themselves. I actually think it has pushed politicians to take it seriously.
So going back to no politician, including yourself, has taken this seriously enough, is there something you specifically regret that you didn't focus enough on when you were leader of the Labour Party?
Well, look, I talked about climate change. I had good policies on climate change, I think, but I didn't talk about it enough. And I think the reason for that is that politics tends to work on a 5-year electoral cycle, so maximum, whereas these are about decisions that we make which will have massive impacts in 10, 20, 30 years' time. Now, my answer to that, how do we, if you like, kind of bring that time frame forward, is by showing, which I genuinely believe, that tackling climate change can also create a better life for people, less air pollution, more jobs, doing the things that I was talking about, retrofitting those buildings, going house by house, street by street. That's thousands of jobs that could be doing that. So I think partly the point of this commission, cross-party, is to say, let's take climate change out of the environmental box alone, important though that is, and put it where it deserves to be, which is about economic justice, social justice for people.
But in terms of the politics of it, if you like, if you create a climate emergency, a national one like you talk about, we can give an example of this. Labour-controlled Manchester City Council, which did declare a climate emergency, but it excluded the airport from the local climate targets, despite the fact that Manchester Airport is majority owned by the councils of Greater Manchester.
Well, I didn't speak for Manchester Council, but I would have included the airport. But
But I'm giving an example of.
I don't know the
you
details.
can declare these emergencies, and then politicians,
it's not a panacea.
Can trim round the edges and ignore.
Well, indeed.
Some of the most important parts.
It's not a panacea. I completely agree with you. It's not a panacea, and part of the job of our commission, cross-party, is to I'm not on the front line of politics, I'm a backbench MP, is to put pressure on all political parties to say, you've got to go further and faster with more urgency.
Do you think the Labour leadership needs to be much more radical? Because, of course, a question that comes to mind is withdrawing support for North Sea oil and gas.
We are going to need to transition out of North Sea oil and gas, yes.
Because only in December of last year, the Shadow Chancellor, John McDonnell, said that he would produce a tax regime that supports the oil and gas industry if Labour wins power at the general election.
I don't know the details of that again, but I mean, if what you're asking me is, do we need to transition out of oil and gas? Absolutely we do, and the transition needs to be a just transition.
But you must be aware that those plans that are being made if Labour takes power, even as a backbencher.
Well, I don't know the details of the tax regime, but I mean, look, if what you're saying to me is we need to change, and one of the things that needs to change is oil and gas, but this, let me make this point, it is also about making sure the transition is just. So I think the other thing this commission needs to do is to say, if we're going to move out of industries that are no longer going to be right for the kind of post-fossil fuel era, how are we going to make sure those workers are protected? I represent a constituency, Doncaster North, where the mines were closed without that just transition. And I think, in a way, I feel like maybe this is a problem of the environmental movement generally. I include myself in this, is that we've talked about the environment, we've talked about that's really matters, but we haven't talked about, well, how do you make this a genuinely just transition and protect the people who are going to be affected by it?
Because, of course, deep mines have also been on the agenda with the opening of a new one and support of that. There are still movements towards areas which shouldn't be supported by what you're saying.
I mean, the one thing I say about this is that there is something called carbon capture and storage, which can help alleviate some of these effects. But you're right. Look, coal is not going to be an answer for us in the future.
And in terms of actually what people can do, I mean, we talk about companies first, businesses first, and then individuals. Reports have shown 100 companies are responsible for 71% of global emissions,
I know,
which is
extraordinary.
It is extraordinary, just to linger on that for a moment. What curbs would you want to see Labour put on those big businesses?
Just fundamentally, I think it's about setting a date by which all of our power comes from renewable sources or non-carbon sources. I include nuclear in that, and making that transition as quickly as we possibly can. So it's about setting the framework, if you like, to get out of that. Now, here's one of the interesting things: onshore wind, which the current government has a real antipathy to because they, people kind of worry that it's an eyesore and so on. That's actually the cheapest technology now. And this is a dramatic change from a decade ago. So I'd say, promote the onshore wind, promote the solar, promote all of these renewable energy sources, because they're absolutely the future.
But what would that date be then? Have you got a view of that as part of this commission?
Well, the commission is just starting. I mean, the date that I set when I was Labour leader was 2030. I think that's obviously sort of relatively soon. That's about a decade away. And there's a big moment on Thursday because the Climate Change Committee, which is the independent body that advises government, will say when we've got to get to zero emissions as a country. That's zero emissions not just in the power sector, but overall. And so it's got to be part of that transition.
So do you think 2030 is realistic still?
I think it is realistic, yes.
Okay, and so by 2030, just to
zero carbon power.
Zero carbon
power.
And the current government's deadline is what?
I don't know.
Okay, so I think it's a decade later, but we can double check that. But that's where you would put it at.
Yeah.
In terms of individuals, you talk about reducing emissions from travel, driving, flying. Do you think we should ration out how many miles that we drive each year?
I think that's quite a hard thing to do because there's this thing called, I think it was Anne from Exeter who said, should we have sort of personal carbon budgets, each of us? I looked at this when I was Climate Change Secretary, and the problem about this is the sort of how you do this in a kind of way that isn't sort of totally Big Brother. You know what I mean? If you're sort of measuring how much every person does, how many miles everyone travels, I think it's more having the tax regime in place, taxing frequent flyers more, for example, so that you kind of change behavior. But the other thing about this is, I know I'm talking about the sort of sacrifice end of it, and that's important, but it's also the benefits. I mean, if you have cities and towns that properly encourage cycling, properly encourage walking, aren't simply catering to the car, and you push forward with electric vehicles faster than this government. I mean, this government is saying no new petrol or diesel vehicles by 2040. I think that is too late. It's behind other countries. Some are 2025, some are 2030. So accelerating that, again, that can create a better life for people, I think.
But in terms of what you can do then, you don't want to be Big Brother, but then at the same time, you do have to lead by example, don't you? I mean, we do have a message saying, is Ed Miliband leading by action? What has he given up? What are you doing differently?
So I am not a paragon of virtue, but I'm eating less meat, and that is part of this. And that's important on health grounds. I'm not vegetarian, but I'm eating less meat. I try and sort of walk and take public transport more and don't try to use my car less. But, as I say, I think individuals are important and individual contributions are important.
Have you given up flying more?
I haven't. Well, I don't fly that much, but I haven't given it up, no. But I think the interesting thing about flying is it's probably the hardest thing that we've got to change because of the technology. So that is probably going to come down the road. But again, I think it's not wrong to talk about the individual action, but I think it's also it's crucially about what government does to kind of influence the decisions that companies and individuals make.
No, I respect that. It's just we have a lot of questions asking.
Fair enough.
How often do you fly?
Fair enough. A few times a year.
A few times.
Yeah.
Would you cut it even more, do you think, in light of your role on this and what you're trying to do?
I try and do as much as I can. I'm sure there's more I can do.
I mean, I think people are thinking about that. So that's why it's important to ask you as someone who's talking about this. I mean, the other issue is, in terms of emissions, the UK is ranked 8th in the world. We're actually not bad in that respect. And I suppose the question that always comes up as well.
8th in a good way, you mean? Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah,
exactly. Sorry.
Yeah.
But I suppose what comes up is why the pressure, if you like, to us to have a national state of emergency while China and India are in the positions that they are in. A lot of people would say we can't really make a difference.
I think we can. And I was at these climate change talks in Copenhagen in 2009, which didn't go brilliantly for a whole range of reasons, the international talks. But one of the things that has given Britain influence, both there and more recently in Paris, which was a more successful set of talks, is the fact that we are generally, as you say, doing better than most. In other words, if we're saying to China and India, come on, guys, you've got to change, if we're not changing ourselves, if we're not leading by example, it's very hard to persuade anyone. And genuinely, I had people from the Chinese delegation and others saying, well, listen, this was when the US was not doing well, which, again, I'm afraid it isn't. They said, well, we'll listen to you because Britain is actually doing quite well and is actually sort of putting its money where its mouth is.
So it's a sort of moral authority.
It is a moral authority.
But at the same time, we can't even sort Brexit out. So how on earth can we be a leader in the world when we can't even extricate ourselves from a supranational organisation?
Well, I mean, Brexit is a mess. But I think,
but by extension, we look like a mess politically.
That might be right. Yes, but whatever happens on Brexit. So, for example, the UK government is bidding to host. The Conservative government is bidding to host the big conference which takes place next year. That sounds like, well, what's the conference going to do? It's a really important moment in 2020 when the world is supposed to submit the plans it has to cut emissions over the next 10 years. And it's, if you like, updating the historic Paris Agreement of 2015. So it's a kind of big deal. I'm totally supportive of that. Whatever happens with Brexit, we should be trying to do that, not just because it's Britain on the international stage, but because I think we can do a good job of that. So I don't think we can let Brexit goodness knows Brexit is crowding out enough. We can't say, well, we can't sort out Brexit, so we can't sort this out.
No, but it's more when you're saying let's declare a state of national emergency, people may already feel we're in one.
Yeah, well, we are, but I suppose if I think in 10 or 20 years' time, important though Brexit is, are my kids going to be more concerned about what we've done or haven't done on climate? I think they are. No, this is the single greatest threat we face.
Can we have two national emergencies going on at the same time?
I don't see why not. I think it's the right thing to do to put this at the centre of everything we do. We can't let Brexit crowd out everything else.
A couple of messages. I did say I'd read them out as we're going, and then we'll come back to this. Well done to Ed, a great cause. I live in Southend and I'm saddened my town has the fastest growing airport in the country. It's encouraged many local people to fly more often. That's what it's done. We should not be encouraging this. People I speak to don't seem to care. If you speak up against flying, they treat you as a crank. I never fly, I go by train if I can. That's John who's listening. Have you been out campaigning on the doorstep this year at all? Have you done any of those chats this year?
Some of that, yes. I
mean, are people raising this to you as an issue?
I think people are increasingly concerned about it, yes.
Okay.
I think it is, it's as I say, I think whatever people think of the protests, they recognise we need to do more.
There's a message here. I have a short life. I'm going to enjoy it. This is from Mark in Solihull. I'm going to eat meat. I'm travelling on planes to see the world. I don't believe climate change is 100% caused, and I'm sure anything the UK does is a drop in the ocean to many other huge nations. The idiots on the protests alienated themselves, and doing it when Parliament wasn't sitting just showed their stupidity.
Well, look, everyone's entitled to their point of view. I think it is important to say this is not about people not having a nice life. I think we can have, we've got thousands of people dying from air pollution. If this was any other issue, people would be marching on the streets about air pollution. By tackling climate change, we can also tackle air pollution. If we have those better forms of public transport, electric vehicles, that will actually, clean up our environment.
You are talking, I get it very much from the point of view what government can do to then guide and change behaviours. However, we are in a situation where, there isn't enough legislation for a Queen's speech right now. We've got all sorts of problems.
Well, there probably is enough legislation. It's just this is the zombie parliament.
The zombie parliament thing. We talked about it at length yesterday.
Right.
And I suppose while you're doing this, that there isn't going to be the appetite for Parliament to take this on when the parties themselves can't even agree a policy over the one thing that's dominating them.
Tomorrow we're going to be debating the call for a climate emergency in the House of Commons. I think there's a motion being put forward by the Labour Party. I was at a meeting last week with Greta Thunberg, the young Swedish teenager who started all the pupil strikes. Michael Gove was there, Liberal Democrats and so on. I think there is a recognition in all parties that we've got to do more as a country, actually, and that we've got to step up on this. But I don't think it's... I think one of the things that we should be pleased about in this country is that we do, unlike in the United States, we actually have more of a cross-party consensus on this. We may not have it on Brexit, but we have it on this, and we've got to try and maintain that. And this commission I'm doing is cross-party, because I think there's an opportunity.
But Paul in Coventry thinks it's political lunacy to declare a state of emergency in peacetime. This isn't the time to give the government draconian powers. It would cause further economic harm to already deprived groups.
I genuinely don't believe it would cause economic harm. I think it would have economic benefit. I think there are thousands, hundreds of thousands of jobs in these industries if we seize the opportunity. China is seizing the opportunity. China is putting in bucket loads of renewable power and is taking the lead on solar, on wind and all of those things. We should be doing that here.
I'm sorry, Ed, it's getting personal here. What is Ed doing apart from eating less meat? Is he driving an electric vehicle? First question.
I'm not driving an electric vehicle.
Why not?
Well, I should be.
When are you going to get one?
As soon as possible.
Next job. In all seriousness, do you have solar panels? It sounds like you're jumping on the bandwagon, this text message says.
Well, look, I'm not jumping on the bandwagon, and I'm not presenting myself as a paragon of virtue. I try and do my best. I'm probably like most kind of,
you should probably get an
normal
electric
people.
Vehicle, shouldn't you?
Okay, I'll have a word at home about it.
Yeah, you might need to do that. Have you got solar panels? Is that part of your energy?
The house I live in doesn't kind of lend itself to solar panels, but I'm trying to do my best.